Recording is now in progress. So I'm Jamie Fine, a senior economist in the Economics and Global Climate Cooperation team at EDF. I've worked principally last couple of years on bus and truck decarbonization, which is really mostly electrification at this point, state and federal policies related to those goals. And I'm forever looking at good research that helps us explore the applied policy questions. There's plenty of research that is a distraction from those questions, but I'm delighted to have Josh Linn presenting work that he did with his colleague Wesley Look, who's also on the call today, who also works with EDF, I think principally on our federal climate initiative work and engaging some policymakers in DC. Josh is a full professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. Wesley's a senior fellow at RFF, and so too is Josh. And so this work was published under RFF. And if you want to say a word or two about the double hats you wear, Josh, as you introduce yourself, I'd welcome that. But without further ado, I'd love to just hand the mic over to you and for us to dive into your paper around US subsidies for buses and trucks. Thanks for being here.
Appreciate that. And thanks very much for inviting me. And hopefully you're looking now at my slides. And really glad to have this opportunity to present this work, which, as Jamie mentioned, the paper was written with Wes Look, and then the research behind it was done in collaboration with some people at Oak Ridge. So I guess I sort of feel compelled to show this kind of chart when we start talking about trucks, and to sort of motivate why we're interested in policies to reduce GHG emissions from medium and heavy duty trucks. So the pie chart on the left, you may have seen in I don't know how many other presentations about US policy. This is showing you the breakdown of GHG emissions by sector. And we see transportation accounts for almost a third of US GHG emissions. Within that transportation sector, over on the right, light duty accounts for more than half. So light duty means passenger vehicles, cars, and light trucks. And that's what, we in public, most of the conversations about cars and light trucks. And I'm guilty of this in my research of, most of my work has been on passenger vehicles, because they are the most important for GHG wise within the transportation sector. But trucks are a big deal too, right? And they account for about a quarter of total transportation emissions, at least as of 2019, and maybe about 7 or 8% of the US total. Moreover, the outlook isn't great. This chart is showing you carbon dioxide emissions forecasted by the Energy Information Administration. This is showing you for the major different types of vehicles within the transportation sector. So at the top, you see the projected CO2 emissions for light duty vehicles. And then the one below that, the blue is trucks. And so, I don't want to get into details about the assumptions behind this. The EIA model is probably fairly conservative on technologies. For policies, they're using only policies that were finalized as of the time of the modeling. And so, if you look at the note at the bottom, they're modeling the Trump administration's light duty standards that, of course, have just been replaced by tighter standards under the Biden administration. So that would make the light duty curve, come down a bit as a result. So I don't want to get into the details, but I think the main takeaway from this slide is that, given current policies, given the ways that, people seem to behave and the types of vehicles they buy and how they drive them, we're not on a pathway to massively reducing GHG emissions from trucks. These emissions are expected to be, pretty flat over the next few decades, really reflecting kind of on the one hand, an increase in utilization of the truck. So more miles, more, long haul freight and more shipping and more deliveries and that kind of stuff. That would be pushing up emissions. And then on the other side, we have anticipated improvements in, diesel engine technology, shifts towards, cleaner technologies. And so that's bringing emissions down. And at least according to the EIA modeling, these two effects are more or less balancing out. And so that's why we end up with pretty flat emissions, projected over the next few decades. And so what that means is, something's got to change, right? I mean, so this is, these projections are based on current policy. So we could have changes in policy. These projections are based on assumptions about, changes in battery costs and evolution of fuel cell technology and stuff like that. But, things need to change relative to those forecasts if we're going to get big reductions in, in the medium and heavy duty trucks, that would be part of a economy-wide transition to a much cleaner economy. So in the trucking sector, there are some big challenges to doing that, right? I mean, it's easy to say that, we need new technology and we need to, encourage adoption of better technology. But there's a lot of challenge here, right? One has to do with the technology. And as I mentioned, I'm kind of coming at this from the lens of like starting from light duty, where I do a lot of my research. Where there, I'd say, we kind of have a good sense of like that there's going to be some transition, a transition from gasoline powered vehicles and some diesel over to electrics. And it's really a question of how quickly, right? Is that going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years, or is it going to take longer than that? And so, I think we have a good sense of what the technology is, and it's a question of how quickly will the, battery costs come down? How quickly will consumers get more excited about electric vehicles? And it sort of is a question of pace. With trucks, it's more fundamentally a question of technology, right? That, there's the battery electric and there's fuel cell electric, which could be good in some applications and less appealing in others. And of course, there's also biofuels in the mix. And one of the reasons why we have more uncertainty about the technology has to do with the fact that there's such a diverse set of buyers and applications in this truck sector, right? So on the buyer side, we have cities purchasing vehicles. We have independent owner operators where it's just some person who is going to own the truck and drive the truck and sort of do have an independent business for trucking. We also have the other extreme kind of large fleet owners that may have dozens or hundreds of trucks and that they manage and operate. So we have lots of different buyers who have different needs. So there are different applications, different ways that they use the trucks, right? We have in this truck sector, we have basically anything bigger than a Ford F-150. And so that's going to include, school buses. It's going to include construction vehicles. It's going to include, local delivery vehicles, things that will have like a home base and then go out, make some deliveries and then come back at night. And then we've got, long haul tractor trailers where they're out for days at a time making deliveries, right? So lots of different applications and the different technologies, the battery electric versus fuel cell in particular, may be more appealing in some of these applications than in others. And so that's sort of adding to the complexity of trying to cut emissions from this sector. Oh, I forgot to mention at the outset, I am happy to take questions as I go. If you want to just jump in, feel free. I may or may not be able to see the chat as I'm talking, but yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you want to along the way. And obviously, and then we've also got time at the end. So either way, it's fine. At any rate, so then the question is, okay, how can we reduce GHG emissions from trucks? And, I think it's pretty safe to say that new technologies are probably going to be needed here. This is an area where I will look to the engineers to see kind of what they say about this. And so recent studies, including a National Academies report, has referred to what I'd characterize as like limited opportunities for improving diesel engine efficiency, right? I think there are still opportunities out there. Efficiency can still get better and probably will, but that's not going to be the way to improving diesel technology is not going to be the way to, virtually eliminate emissions from this sector. And that may be more of a transitional approach, but not in the long term. We just can't make them, infinitely efficient, in other words. Then for thinking about, okay, well, how are we going to accelerate the transition to new technologies? I think a natural place to look at would be to subsidizing adoption of the technologies. I mean, we've got a lot of experience with that. If I can jump over to the power sector just for a moment, right, where we have been subsidizing wind and solar for quite some time. And so I think there's sort of, some comfort and familiarity with that approach. And to sort of support that point, right, is the fact that the Build Back Better proposal had an investment tax credit for commercial vehicles, and so this would have covered basically all of the trucks in the medium and heavy duty sector, virtually all of them at least, and would have offered buyers a tax credit of 30%. And we'll actually say there are various proposals about, with different numbers floating around, but offering basically the buyer a subsidy when you make that purchase. And so this idea is sort of, is out there, like there's some experience with it. And it may, it could be that one of the ways that we try to make that transition to encourage the technology. And so then what we do in this analysis is to consider how would a 30% investment tax credit, or ITC, how would that affect purchases of transit buses, day cabs, and sleeper cabs? So the policy that we're modeling is going to include a 30% subsidy. So if your truck would cost $100,000, the government's going to subsidize $30,000 of that purchase. We're also including in this modeling subsidies for infrastructure, and this this policy that we're modeling is sort of trying to characterize recent proposals that we've seen in Congress. Not necessarily trying to get all the details right, but just trying to approximate the various ideas that we've seen out there. And so we want to understand how would these subsidies affect greenhouse gas emissions, out into the future. And so to understand that, we really need to predict, well, first of all, how are these subsidies going to affect bus and truck purchases? And so that effect is going to depend on, what are the purchase prices? Like, is a 30% ITC, a 30% subsidy, is that enough to get people to switch to battery electric trucks? It's going to depend on, as well as how much do you drive the truck. So like, if you drive your truck a lot, then switching to electric may save you more money than if you don't drive the truck very much. And fuel prices are going to matter too, right? I mean, diesel prices are going to play a role, as well as electricity prices are going to affect that truck purchase decision. And then we need to not just understand how will this subsidy affect truck purchases, because that's, it's only affecting that purchase decision, but then we need to understand how would an increase in electric trucks caused by the subsidy affect the overall greenhouse gas emissions of all the trucks that are on the road. And so now we need to understand, okay, how are trucks being driven? How many miles are they driven per year? How quickly are vehicles scrapped? How quickly do they get retired? And in other words, what's the turnover of that on-road stock of trucks, right? So we need to understand not just the purchase decision, but also the utilization and scrappage decisions as well. So there's a lot that needs to go into an analysis of this sort of policy. And so how do we do that? Well, we've developed a computational model. And in this model, we focus on three types of vehicles. One, are, as I mentioned, are transit buses, day cabs, and sleeper cabs. And that's largely because of data. We also wanted to make sure that we include sleeper cab. By this, I mean, a cab that can be used to drive a trailer or to pull a trailer. And it can be taken on long distance trips, right? So overnight trips. And so we want to include especially those sleeper cabs because they make up a very large share of total GHG emissions from the medium and heavy duty truck sector, right? I mean, there's not a lot of those trucks compared to some of the others, but they're driven a lot of miles, tens of thousands of miles each year. So in the model, we have these three different markets, right? Three different types of trucks. And each buyer is going to choose either a diesel powered truck or a battery electric truck. So I'll just note, and I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but I'll note that we're not including fuel cell trucks in this analysis. So it's just that choice between diesel and battery electric. This choice is going to depend on what we'll call the total cost of ownership. So it is going to include the price that you pay when you buy the truck, and that'll be the price net of any subsidy you might get. And it'll also include the future cost of operating the vehicle and maintaining the vehicle. And so those future costs, especially the fuel costs in particular, are going to depend on how much do you expect to drive the truck, and what are the fuel prices. So what's the price of diesel and what's the price of electricity, for the electric trucks. And then it's also going to depend on a discount rate, because we're assuming that the buyer is comparing the total cost of owning the vehicle, but discounting those future fuel costs. And so then we've got to choose a discount rate that the buyer is going to apply to those future fuel costs. And so what this means is that the technology choice, whether you choose diesel or electric, is going to depend on your preferences. It's going to depend on your discount rate. So like if you have a low discount rate, then you're going to really care a lot about those future fuel costs. If you have a high discount rate, then you don't care as much. It's also going to depend on your miles driven, right? So if an electric truck has a lower cost per mile, that means that there's a bigger benefit of switching from diesel to electric if you drive a lot, compared to if you don't drive very much. And so what this means is that buyers who drive a lot and who have low discount rates are more likely to buy electric than other buyers, right? So we're trying to account for this some heterogeneity, some variation in the preferences across the buyers in these markets. So we have three scenarios that we'll look at. One is we'll call a baseline. This is using a low pace of battery cost reduction. I'll show you what those numbers look like on the very next slide. But it's going to be sort of a gradual reduction in battery costs. And we're going to, and there's no subsidy offered in this scenario. And so we're going to simulate truck choices starting actually sort of backing up and starting from 2005, because we're going to simulate the model from 2005 through 2020 to basically populate the set of all the stock of all vehicles on the road, right? There's not very good data on exactly what the trucks are on the road. And so we're going to use the model to basically create that on-road stock of trucks. And then we'll keep simulating the model forwards from 2020 through 2035 to then predict emissions into the future through 2035. So that's the baseline scenario. Then we have the first of the two policy scenarios. The first one is a 30% investment tax credit. So again, you get a 30% subsidy when you buy an electric truck. And the technology cost assumptions are the same as in the baseline. And that's contrasting with the last scenario, the second policy case, the high technology case, which have the same assumptions as the low technology case, except that battery costs are falling more quickly. And so these battery costs are falling quickly independently of the policy, right? So this is just an exogenous change in battery costs not being driven by the policy itself. So this table here shows you some of the key assumptions that we make in the model. So this is taken from one of the tables in the appendix of the paper, and I've sort of zoomed in on a few of the key assumptions here. So the first row is showing you annual sales for the three different vehicle types: transit buses, day cabs, and sleeper cabs. Notice that the transit bus market is just much smaller than the other two markets. Also notice that those transit buses are not driven nearly as much as the other trucks. And the sleeper cabs are driven quite a bit more, close to 100,000 miles per year on average. The row below that then shows the standard deviation of miles traveled. And so this is getting at that variation across buyers in how much they drive. And so that variation, again, that's going to affect that decision about do you buy diesel or electric. And so, for example, for the sleeper cabs, the standard deviation is about 30,000 miles, meaning that there are quite a few buyers out there who would drive their truck 100, even 150,000 miles per year. And so they're going to be driving them much more intensively than the typical buyer or than some of the buyers at the other extreme of the distribution. Then the next two rows are showing you discount rates, right? It's a 3% discount rate for transit bus. We're assuming that it's a government that's buying those transit buses, and so they have lower borrowing costs, and then a 7% discount rate. We're assuming that those are commercial firms that are buying those trucks. And we also have a lot of variation right, in those in those discount rates across those customers. Then the bottom of the table, which has got a lot of numbers in there, so I'll show you where to focus. That is showing you the implications of our technology assumptions, right? So the first part here is showing you the purchase prices of the battery electric vehicles. And this base really is corresponding to the low technology scenario. We see that in 2020, a transit bus is going to cost $324,000 some odd dollars, and that cost drops to about $185,000 by 2030. That cost drops even further in the high technology case. And the difference is just that batteries have gotten much cheaper in that high technology case. And so that's why those transit buses are so much cheaper. And it's a similar pattern in the day cabs and sleeper cabs. And notice that these sleeper cabs start out really expensive, right? Almost $1 million for a truck in 2020. Whereas if you were to buy a diesel truck in 2020, that would cost about $144,000, right? So it's a gigantic difference in those prices. And so that's going to mean that, for virtually every buyer, a 30% investment tax credit is not going to do anything, right? You're still not going to be interested in that electric truck in 2020. But by 2030, especially with the high technology case, you take that, you add in the 30% ITC, and also consider the fact that some of the buyers are driving a lot. Right now, these battery electrics are going to look more appealing than diesel. Okay, so that's sort of anticipating what I'm going to show you on this slide, which is showing you what happens when we introduce the subsidies. And so the bottom is showing you the blue, the darker blue is showing you the baseline. Light blue is adoption with the 30% ITC in the low technology case, and then red is the high technology case. And so you're looking at number of vehicles sold per year across those three categories of trucks, right? And just remember that, given the sales numbers here, those total sales numbers are being dominated by the day cabs and sleeper cabs relative to the transit buses. And so in the baseline case, we see virtually no adoption of electric trucks. And even by 2030 or even by 2035, the battery electrics just are not cost competitive with the in the low technology assumptions. But with a 30% ITC, we see more interest in the electric trucks starting around 2030. With the high technology case, or again, bigger battery cost reductions, now we see the basically interest in these trucks starting earlier, and we see the sales of these trucks, really taking off in the late 2020s, right? That's because battery costs have fallen enough that you take the battery cost reduction, you add in the subsidy, and suddenly lots of people want these trucks by the late 2020s. Over on the right, you're looking at the federal tax expenditure in billions of dollars. And this is, I think, interesting to look at because it gives you a sense of how the subsidies are affecting adoption and really when they're most important. In particular, look at the red curve here, right, showing you an increase in expenditures and then a decrease. Recall though that sales are still high in the 2030s, but the expenditures going down. And really what's going on is that the subsidy is getting phased out because it's just not needed anymore. That the battery costs have fallen enough that people are happy. A lot of truck buyers are happy buying trucks, buying electric trucks without the subsidy. And so the subsidy is phasing out, but the sales still stay high even though the subsidy is phasing out. I should mention the reason the subsidy phases out is that was something that we included in the modeling because that was also included in some of those proposals that were circulating, which was that once we hit some date, like some calendar day, or it might be based on the market share, the total sales of these electric trucks, then that subsidy starts phasing out, and so that's what we were modeling in this scenario.
Josh, this is Jamie. Apologies for interruptions. I'm just aware that your co-author, Wes, needs to take off in about 3 minutes, and I wanted to make sure he had a chance to offer a word or two if he felt the need before he had to say goodbye.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I really don't feel like I have much to add. This is comprehensive presentation of the work. So carry on, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining, Wes.
You bet.
Actually, is there something? Never mind. Okay, so this slide now is showing you basically trying to temper expectations. So about how quickly we can cut GHG emissions. I think this sort of thing we have found is sort of particularly important to show to policymakers and advocates to try to understand the link between the subsidies that affect the new vehicle sales and how that's going to affect emissions. And even though on the previous slide we saw that virtually all new trucks were electric by 2030 or so, the percentage of electric buses and trucks in the on-road stock is growing very gradually, right? Even in that case where all of the new trucks are electric, the thing is we've got all these older trucks that are out there, they're all running on diesel, and it's a very gradual process of replacing those older diesel trucks with the new electric trucks. And so even by 2035, just more than half of the on-road stock is electric, even though we've been selling those electric trucks at almost 100% market share for some years before that. And so that means that, for carbon dioxide emissions, that it's going to be a gradual reduction in carbon dioxide emissions coming from these types of trucks, right? That with the subsidy, that red curve only starts to really diverge, starting in the late 2020s and growing over time as those electric trucks replace those diesel trucks, right? So that, by 2035, that subsidy has reduced emissions by about 50% relative to that no subsidy case. Notice that the subsidy in the low technology case does reduce emissions, but just not all that much, right? And that's coming from the fact that the subsidy is not affecting sales until later in time, and also because it's then going to be a gradual transition where those electric trucks are replacing diesel. And so we would then expect those two curves, the light blue and the dark blue, to then start diverging over time. So this table here now shows you the cost effectiveness of these policies. So this is what's the subsidy expenditure divided by the GHG reduction. And the main point I want to illustrate here is that the cost effectiveness varies a lot depending on the technology assumption. So this is the low technology assumption and the high technology assumption in the other column. And then the different rows are just showing you over different budget windows, 5-year, 10-year, or through 2035. And we see that the cost effectiveness is just much higher with the 30% ITC. And the reason is that that subsidy is more effective at changing people's minds. That you have a lot of buyers in the high technology case that are sort of close to to buying electric, but not quite there. And then the subsidy pushes them over the edge and gets them to buy. And there are just many fewer of those types of buyers in the low technology case, just because that gap between the electric truck cost and the diesel cost is still pretty high even by 2030. To give you a sense of what these numbers are reflecting, and I realize now I did not put units on this table, so this is dollars per ton of CO2 reduction. These numbers are sort of in the ballpark of estimates for light duty electric vehicle subsidies, right? If you subsidize purchases of new passenger vehicles, new electric passenger vehicles, estimates, some that I've done, some other research have done, are usually in the like $100 to $300 per ton kind of range. So, similar level of cost effectiveness, at least in the high technology scenario. Okay, so I have one slide on conclusions and then one slide on future work, and then I will stop talking and then let Jamie talk and then get some questions. So first of all, I'd say 4 things I want to highlight at the end here, right? One is that we see very little adoption of battery electric buses and trucks without the subsidies. Even in the low technology case, actually we've also modeled a high technology case without the subsidies, which I haven't shown you, but even there, we don't see a lot of adoption without the subsidies. The rate of battery cost adoption plays a big role in the efficacy of the policy, right? That's what that last table was showing you, much more cost effective with high rapid battery cost reductions. So that also, then we kind of speculate a bit on this in the paper. It's obviously beyond the scope of what we're doing, but this also does sort of have some implications for other types of policies that might help reduce battery costs, right? Policies that are promoting innovation and demonstration of new manufacturing abilities, new technologies, things like that, that could help accelerate the pace of battery cost reduction. That could sort of complement these truck purchase subsidies, right? So there's sort of an opportunity to have some complementary policies there. As I mentioned a moment ago, the fiscal cost effectiveness for the, at least for the high technology cases, is comparable to the light duty subsidies. Now I want to try to express a bit of modesty for this analysis, which is that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty here, right? We have been assuming in this modeling that buyers are making decisions based on total cost of ownership, and that they will compare the total costs and buy the one that works better for them. That is not based on what we observe in the market. This is not based on some analysis of buying behavior. This is because this was sort of the most straightforward way to model it, and I think a natural starting point. And so that brings me to our future work, right? And so taking what we have, which is, I think sort of a good starting point, but includes a lot of simplifications and a lot of strong assumptions, which is to try to ground those assumptions more clearly in the way we observe buyers and drivers behaving. And so we want to study, how do buying decisions respond to vehicle prices and fuel prices and the performance of the technology, and including like infrastructure availability and all that kind of stuff, right? And so what can we learn from the way that people have been making these decisions to try to anticipate how they might respond to future subsidies? And I think that would be a different type of an approach compared to this total cost of ownership approach. We can also look at driving decisions, right? We've been assuming that in all these scenarios, there's a certain way that these trucks are driven and then they get scrapped. We would like to take a closer look at the data to understand, in general, how those decisions made, and how might either these policies or other types of policies, affect those driving and scrappage decisions. And then finally, we were just looking at the cost effectiveness of these policies, in what's the cost to the government per ton of emissions reduction. We have, as I mentioned, a diverse set of buyers and sellers in the market. We have, big owners of large fleets. We have independent owner operators. We have local governments. How would they be affected by these policies, right? What are the costs of these policies and what are the benefits of these policies? And including in the benefits, I think we want to, it's important to discuss not just the greenhouse gas benefits, and that's been the focus today, but the local air pollution, right? Including, particulates and nitrogen oxides that, switching from diesel to battery electric is certainly going to reduce those emissions, particularly locally where these trucks are being driven. And so that's an important thing that, we would like to account for. So I think that brings me to the end. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to the discussion after this. And thanks again for the opportunity to speak.
Speak louder, Jamie. Louder, Jamie.
Maybe not louder, but maybe just with the mute turned off. I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Richard. So I want to invite you to post questions or comments you have in the chat, and we'll try to pick those up appropriately. The idea now is I'm going to take about 5 minutes to offer some kind of discussion responses. Josh is going to respond to that, and then we'll have a broader Q&A. And for those who really want to dig into some additional details and hash things out a bit, we're going to go off recording at the hour and maybe spend another 30 minutes chatting if there's interest. So as a starting point, thank you, Josh, not just for being here today, but for doing this work. This really truly is my favorite paper of the year, and probably my favorite paper of last year too, even though it wasn't published last year. And it's really two big reasons. First, you're providing a very understandable, well-communicated set of findings that are very policy relevant to conversations we're having today at the state and federal level. Just last year, I was trying to do math around the question of how much money do we need to put in a green bank to have appropriate amount of subsidies to help the transportation sector evolve towards clean. And your math is much more robust than what I tried to do. But this is a very timely piece of work. And it also shows us a way methodologically, right? The point you make about the massive uncertainties, mass is the wrong word, the diversity and complexity of uncertainties. This is what us analysts would call it, deliciously wicked problem, but one that we can't necessarily solve. And you've really started to tackle it by describing these uncertainties as distributions and then modeling those distributions. So I want to thank you for that. And I think you've tackled the two big pieces of uncertainty in terms of use intensity, which you're describing in terms of VMTs, and in terms of discounting rate, how the buyer thinks about present versus future costs and benefits or cash flows. And I think that's the right way to do it. And of course, it tees up a very robust conversation about discount rates and what it really means. And we'll probably get to that later. There are, of course, other uncertainties that we might want to describe stochastically, such as fuel prices that we've just seen in the last month. Gasoline or diesel prices have gone up, 30% at the pumps. So in terms of the modeling work itself, I want to make a couple comments about where it goes or where it might go a little further. I love that you've tackled this by modeling 3 different kind of vehicle types that we can all kind of get our heads around. Oftentimes we're seeing analytics that are talking about class 7 or certain types of vehicles that most of us don't really understand what those are. So I think you've provided something that's descriptive and captures much of the market. Of course, if you think about a transit bus, we can recognize there are different types of buses that are in use, different types of transit, regional versus urban, and then school buses. And when we get into day cabs and short haul, long haul, I should say, there's obviously even more complexity of application as well as the logistics of how charging happens. So for example, we think a lot of the charging in the near term is going to happen for applications where you can have a return to site on a single day and do depot charging. And I don't know how that would play out in the description that you've developed. Some of the applications that might be interesting to tease out of these different vehicle types would be yard hostling or shuttle or box truck applications. And also to think about the economies of scale versus individual vehicles versus larger fleets when we're describing uncertainties. Again, I love what you've done here with using distributions. I'm curious if you've been able to corroborate the distributions that you've described, because what we often say is we want to describe the uncertainty using distributions, but we don't know what the distribution is. We don't understand the shape or form. So I appreciate that you've done that, and I'd love your thoughts on that. And in terms of the scenarios, again, applaud the treatment of high and low cost treatments. There's actually a little bit of confusion from the folks receiving the work, because there are other elements in this, such as the declining ITC, the declining subsidy once you get to 50% of sales. And some of these other factors make it maybe a little bit hard to understand just what the scenarios are. But that is what it is. And I think you're appropriately doing scenario analysis. The other big piece of scenario analysis, of course, is not just the tailpipe emissions, but the grid-related emissions, which again, I'm glad you've set aside here. I actually don't want to comment that much on the emissions math you've done here, which I think is appropriately illustrative and at scale, but of course we could tangle with more precision there if we wanted to. So my last comments are related to the fiscal analyses. I think it's a terrific question to ask: how much public monies do you need to put into subsidies? That's an appropriate fiscal question. I think other fiscal questions that we're seeing as we tangle with vehicle electrification are impacts to city coffers, right? So for example, a big one is gasoline tax revenue. What does that mean? What does it mean if we go away from buying gasoline tax for municipalities or jurisdictions that rely on those kinds of revenues too? So fiscal impacts could be a broader conversation if we wanted it to be. And then another piece of this fiscal impacts, and as we know, a very policy relevant question is: how much public infrastructure, public charging should we be providing? And we're really thinking about that for those vehicle owners and operators that are kind of at the far end of the distribution, that are going to have a hard time affording to get into new electric. And so the question is, if we were providing the infrastructure at no cost to them, except for the cost of the electricity, how would that change these results? And I think that's a very policy relevant question that we we may want to try to tangle with in the future. And then I'm curious if you think that the findings would be dramatically different if you reran the numbers now for different energy prices, and if that would even be appropriate. You mentioned some EIA forecasts, and we know those tend to be biased. And so it'd be interesting to tangle with that a bit. And then my final question for you, maybe for discussion, and maybe we'll tee up other comments, is this analysis is based on total cost of ownership comparisons. We know there are other, as you said, many other kind of cost components to transitioning to electric. We have a study that we call the total cost of electrification, which was trying to document those soft costs. I'll be happy to share a link to that. But we also know that oftentimes businesses make decisions based on metrics such as payback period or return on investment or cash flow or dollar per mile of doing the work. And I'm curious if you've thought about those metrics and how that might speak to your findings. You mentioned earlier in your last slide, some analysis related to welfare effects. And I think that's a piece of it, right? I think what I should do is leave it there. I can start to get wound up and keep going, but I'd like to invite others to offer comments or thoughts or think about what those might be. I see one has come in from Richard, but I also want to give you a chance to respond, Josh, while I pick up Richard's question here, and then we'll go to that discussion.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jamie. Very much, well, for kind words about the analysis. I appreciate that, and also for those really constructive and helpful suggestions and questions. So we, in general, we have ambitions, and I'd say we are cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to do a really concerted effort to dramatically advance the modeling here over the next 2 years or so. These things take time, and so it's going to be a little while, but I think that's, and the hope is that we'll be able to produce analysis along the way as we go. And I think we hope it's going to incorporate a lot of what you said, and I think we'll add in some of the things based on your comments, and maybe a bit more. So I'll just say a couple things, and then I can address the questions that have been showing up in the chat. So first of all, we're expecting better data soon. There was a survey that was done every 5 years ago, the Vehicle Inventory and Use Survey, that ended in 2002. And so they have, that survey has just been restarted, and we are hoping to get data from that should be made public next year. I don't know, maybe in the next year or two. So that I think is really going to help a lot, sort of ground those assumptions about the heterogeneity and some of the other assumptions, because we'll have data from surveys about how much these trucks are actually being driven and what's the variation, across different buyers and different owners, and then within each type. I think the questions you raise about infrastructure are really important. From one side, just thinking about the buyer's decision, right? Your decision is really going to depend a lot on the cost of fueling, and not just the per kilowatt hour cost, but also the convenience and the time you might have to spend in doing that. And so, like you're saying, it's totally different story if you have a home base. If you're doing local deliveries, you can go back at night and charge up, and then you're ready to go the next morning. That's completely different from trying to take one of these trucks across the country. You've got to, the infrastructure's got to be there. It's got to be where you want it, and you need to be able to time it so that you're not losing lots of time when you'd otherwise be driving. And so these are things that we think we can incorporate in the modeling of how people make buying decisions, and we can see how at least diesel prices and maybe in a few cases sort of the availability of alternative fuel infrastructure might affect those buying decisions. There's not a lot of data to go on, obviously, and so I think that we're going to have to sort of approximate that, and that's going to be a really important issue in the future, right? As there are more infrastructure investments, we need to understand how is that going to affect demand, because the effectiveness of any other policy, like a subsidy, a purchase subsidy, is going to depend a lot on that consumer response to the infrastructure investments. Let me see. So then, and like I said, I don't want to take all the time up sort of responding to all of the other interesting questions I think that you raised. I want to turn to this question about, from the chat, about learning by doing. And I think that, it's important to appreciate that, the applications and the way the batteries would be used, and obviously fuel cell, is fundamentally different from light duty, right? And that, the battery packs are just much, much bigger. There are different considerations compared to light duty. And ideally, we would not lump all that together, right? And in other words, that it's not necessarily true that improvements in the technology that benefit light duties are going to carry over one for one to trucks. And I think that's something that we ought to get a better handle on that, and sort of try to model that more explicitly.
So Josh, can I just follow up on that?
Yeah, please.
My point is actually learning by doing within the trucking technology sector. That's what I wasn't thinking about, learning by doing across the automotive sector. So this is in California. They made a major mistake and when they were signing power purchase agreements for solar, that they failed to account for this learning by doing effect and what impact it had actually on the power sector across the globe. And so we're actually paying way too high electricity prices for that reason. So it's one of those things that I was just thinking about that in the trucking sector.
Yeah, I agree. And I was trying to express, but not that clearly, sort of agreement that understanding how the learning by doing works within the trucking sector is really important, that we can't just assume that it's all batteries are batteries and these things, everything is going to work together. Like the learning by doing is really going to be specific to the trucking sector, and these policies could accelerate that. And I completely agree that that's something that we ought to account for.
And actually, my point on this is because it is the trucking sector is so narrow, the learning by doing effects could actually be very, very large because it's affecting a much smaller starting base of production.
Yeah, so, right, exactly. In percentage terms, it could be a much bigger deal. Yeah, I agree with that. If I can transition that to think about, so this is raising questions about dynamics, right? And I think that it's really important to think about dynamics, not just on the supply side, on the battery cost side and technology side, but also on the demand side. I think this is something that we have totally not missed out on and not included in light duty, and certainly not in trucks either. And by dynamics, I mean, how does adoption of electric trucks today affect demand for electric trucks in the future, right? So if you're a large fleet owner and you buy a few of these and test them out, your experience early on, right? If this really works for you, then maybe you'll want more in the future. But if it doesn't work for you, like if you try it out and whatever, the infrastructure is not there, the technology doesn't work as well as it's supposed to, then that would have negative consequences for that future demand. And that's obviously really hard to get at those dynamics. Like, how are we going to parameterize a model that's going to capture that? But that's something I think, is I don't want to make it a horse race, but I'd say it's also important, in addition to the supply side, the technology types of learning by doing, these dynamics on the demand side are also really important to think about.
I want to invite others to post questions, or just to, if you want to turn on your video and join the conversation. I wanted to, if I have a moment now, since I don't see other questions, bring up the issue of free riders and how we think about discount rates. Those are two different things. I think you commented that, I don't remember exactly in the paper, that in a high technology scenario, you'll have more free riders because the technology will be cheaper and they're taking a subsidy when they would have bought the vehicle anyway. Is there more you would like to say about that? And I guess I think about that and I juxtapose that with firms that maybe have a very high discount rate because they're turning over their fleet very quickly and then they aren't necessarily so worried about that additional useful life in the last few years of the vehicle. So they've quickly discounted that. And then how do they think about that in the context of transitioning to a new vehicle and subsidies? I don't know if that was a clear question.
Yeah, so starting with the question about free riding, or you could think of it as like inframarginal buyers, that like they're the people whose decisions are not being affected by the subsidy, but they get the money anyway. And I'm glad Richard brought up solar because it certainly was true in solar. Similar issues arise in solar policy, and actually in the graduate class that I've been teaching this semester, we were just discussing a paper about this yesterday. So it's very fresh in my mind, as it turns out, because if you think about it from a buyer's perspective, whether it's solar panels or a new truck, many times you'll have a decision like, do you buy it now or do you wait some time, right? So like if you're buying a truck, you could buy the diesel now, you'll be on the market 5 years from now again. So you could buy it now or you could adopt it later. Or putting solar panels on your roof, you could do it now or you could wait a few years. And so that'll depend on, where you think the technology is going. How quickly do you think costs are going to come down, right? Because if you think costs are going to come down really quickly, why buy now when you can wait a few years and get it for much cheaper? So I think that's one consideration, that consumers may be thinking about, but they may also be thinking about the subsidy itself, right? If you design a subsidy where it's going to be, very big initially and then phase out, right? That may sort of cause people to not wait as long, but instead buy sooner. That it could have that effect. On the other hand, it could be that the people who are likely to buy now are those what we might call like early adopters, like the ones who drive a lot or really, being, low emissions as part of the product or services that they provide. And so that's who they want to be and who they want to be thought of as. And so they're going to buy these technologies early, no matter what you do. And so if you offer a big subsidy early, you may just be giving lots of money to those early adopters who would have bought anyway. And so it's really difficult to sort of figure out which of these factors is going to be dominating, right? Because one is suggesting you ought to offer an increasing subsidy over time, right? You want to delay it so that you're not just paying those early adopters. The other is suggesting maybe you do want to offer a bigger subsidy early. So how do we figure out which to do? Well, we need to understand the preferences of these buyers and how they make these decisions and how they trade off the current, the present and the future. And so that ties into your question about discount rates, right? That we need to understand, it's not really just, what is the cost of borrowing money for them, right? I mean, it's firms are often making this decision in a different sort of way, right? Thinking, as you were saying, about like payback periods and stuff like that. And so that's something that I think that we could, try to observe and see what kind of payback periods that these trucks are requiring. And then we can use that information to think about this type of subsidy design.
Richard, I just posted a comment. Do you want to share it with the audience who might not be reading the chat?
Yeah, so I never read the chat myself. So, so early adopters, actually, I mean, we look at this and early adopters have expectations about what's going to happen. But as economists, sometimes we overlook the fact that that there's wide ranges of uncertainty into the future. And in fact, these early adopters are taking a risk by doing that. Sure, it looks like it's going to pay out, but it might not. And so I actually have this debate over solar rooftop. People claim, oh, people took no risk in building solar rooftops in California. Wrong. California utility rates in the mid 2010s were actually flat during that time, and the appreciation rate was not going up. And so you were taking a risk that the rates would not appreciate and that they would not go up. And so so it's the same thing here, is that I think that actually paying the subsidies is a way of mitigating, can be viewed as a way of mitigating the risk of early adopters, to give them surety of their choice. So sure, it looks like you're incenting early adopters to that that they would make the decision anyway. But in fact, it's more of you're giving them an insurance policy that their decision was the right decision or the decision that you wanted to make. And therefore, it's justified for that reason.
Yeah, I agree that we should think about the special aspects of the early adopters, like what makes them special, and that may point to sort of subsidizing them. I would not, though, have put the focus on their risk, right? I mean, normally, there are lots of things that we do that are risky, and we don't subsidize that, right? I may take on lots of risk, in my personal investments. I don't get subsidies for that. So there's got to be some reason why that decision is going to, create some benefit, right? That why do we want to reduce their risk in order to get them to adopt? And so that, in that sense, I would sort of put the emphasis on the information, right? That their adoption is providing information to other people, right? That like when you put the solar panels on your roof, do they really perform as well as advertised? Or when you buy your battery electric truck, does the battery really last as long as you were told it would? Things like that, where there's information that you'll learn as an early adopter that then can be gathered by other people. That's a reason why I think that we would want to reduce their risk, right? But the risk per se is not, that's not a reason for subsidizing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good